Now it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Janet Scarlett, who comes to us from Cornell University, where she serves as professor of epidemiology and also the director of Maddie's Shelter Medicine Program. She has participated in some of the first scientific studies on the reasons for pet relinquishment and has ever since published numerous papers on shelter-related issues, including pediatric neutering, feline upper respiratory tract infections, and the effectiveness in general of the spay-neuter programs. Dr. Scarlett.
Thank you. So before getting started, I wanted to thank Mr. and Mrs. Gress for enabling this conference to take place. I'd also like to thank Dr. Noonan for inviting me to participate in this. What a pleasure it is to listen to all of the varied talks and whatever that I wouldn't normally hear because in the school or in the circles in which I participate. We're going to talk about the welfare of shelter cats. As you can well imagine, as is true of many of the topics covered today, we could have a whole symposium on the welfare of shelter cats. So what I am going to do, what I'm striving to do, is just give you a glimpse into some of the issues that surround providing good welfare for our shelter cats. So we've already seen a lot of data about, and I wanted to put this into context because I think you can't talk about the shelters without understanding the milieu in which these shelters exist. So we know Americans love their pets. And some of the reason I think that we're seeing some discrepancies in these numbers, one is it's notoriously difficult to get really good data. The other is that we just recently had a new AVMA study come out, which was published and just made available within the last month or so. So that's where the 74 million cats is coming from as opposed to 86 to 88 million animals. But what I wanted to point out here is that we're talking about 30%, or 1 in every 3 households that owns a cat in this country. That's in 2011. That's down about 6% since 2006. These are AVMA data. And that translates into about 36 million households that have cats in this country. That's also down. And I mention that because if you look at the AVMA data, and you got to be a little bit careful going across who collects the data, but these are by the AVMA. In 2006, there were an estimated 82 million cats, and it looks like it's come down to 74 million cats, or roughly a 9% decline in cat ownership. Is this a reflection of the recession and economic issues? I don't know. Is this the beginning of a trend? I don't know, but I think it's something that we will want to definitely watch. I think somebody else showed these figures before. About 56% of our cat-owning public believe that these animals are family members. They will describe them as that. 42% as pet or companions, and fortunately only 2% seeing them as strictly property. So we love our pets. We spend a lot of money on our pets. And I think somebody else had $7 billion. I don't know if that was just veterinary care. But anyway, the point is this is a billion-dollar industry. And the reason I'm making these points is we love our cats. We spend a lot of money on our cats. But in fact, there's a darker side, an underbelly to what our relationship with our cats. And it's really hard, even if you think it's hard to get data on how many cats are owned, then try to get data on how many cats are actually coming into shelters and get precise data. But we think somewhere between 3 and 3.5 million cats are coming into our animal shelters annually. We're not even quite sure how many shelters there are, hence the difficulty of finding out how many cats there are. What about the characteristics of the entering cats? This is a really complicated issue. It really depends on a lot of things. I always say the students always hate that word depends because they want to know what is it like. Well, it really does depend. If you go into the average shelter in the Northeast in the summertime, you're going to see a preponderance of kittens. Kittens coming out everywhere. You go into the shelter in February, and kittens are not nearly as common, but we see a lot of more adult cats. The type of shelter. Many of our government shelters, depending on the state and depending on what the laws are, may not even take in cats because they're not mandated at the state level to provide for animal control for cats. Also depends upon the admission policies. If you're working in a adoption guarantee, which is the politically correct way of calling a no-kill shelter, they're limiting admission. So many times those shelters are saying, who are we going to accept? They're going to accept animals that they have a higher likelihood of adopting out, whether it's a sanctuary or not. Sanctuaries depends on what the policies are. Many sanctuaries are tending, in order to fund themselves, tending to take animals that come with some kind of money associated with them. Somebody has died and left those animals to that sanctuary. So it really depends on what you're talking about, what the characteristics are of these animals. Just to put it in context with dogs and cats, again, it depends on where you are in the country. In the Northeast, where we have most of our experience, usually we have about 2 cats for every dog that entered the shelter. It's about 2/3 cats, 1/3 dogs. I looked at some of the data from PetPoint. Now, this is not a representative sample. I acknowledge that. But this is based on almost 2,000 shelters. And their intake would suggest that, in fact, more dogs are being brought in than cats. And what that is a reflection of, I'm not quite sure. But the point being that it's highly variable. Here's just a kind of a very crude schematic of intake and outflow from shelters. But for those of you who aren't really accustomed to thinking about shelters, cats enter shelters either being surrendered by their owners, come in as strays. They may be a returned adoption, that is a failed adoption, that being usually a very small proportion of the animals coming in. And while transfer programs are very popular and account for many dogs coming into, especially our northeastern shelters, not so many cats. Often it's a very regional transfer of cats between shelters. So our goal then is to shrink that intake. The shelters are working to try to keep animals from coming into shelters. And I'm going to talk more about outcomes a little bit further in the discussion, but certainly we want to increase the outflow by not relying upon euthanasia and certainly by minimizing natural deaths in shelters. So I have to touch just briefly, and I think others have done better than I will do here, but just to recognize that the number or the proportion of animals that are neutered among that large free-roaming population is very, very small as compared to 80% plus in our owned cats. So these guys have to be contributing to all those kittens that are coming in seasonally. This is just to remind you that the biggest single age group coming into shelters, and these numbers are dated now, but I think that the relative sizes probably hasn't changed much. That biggest single numbers are still kittens. We still have a kitten problem. In the Northeast and in many areas of the country, with the exception of the Southeast, we don't have a puppy problem. A lot of shelters are looking for puppies and small dogs. And then the second largest age group are the young adolescent cat, the one that's no longer quite so cute, but now maybe urinating outside the box or whatever. So I haven't said anything about welfare yet, so let's concentrate a little bit on that. And I've kind of partitioned this into 3 areas. One is intake, which I've kind of talked about already, but I want to talk about a little bit more. And then also outcome, and then what happens within the shelter itself. So what happens to shelter cats? Well, they can be adopted, which would be our preference. They can be euthanized, they can be transferred, although not that hasn't happened to the same degree as in dogs. They can die, or they can be returned to their owner, that is, their strays. And we've already heard that a very small proportion, somewhere around 2%, 3%, do we have return rates. And Barbara commented extensively on why we don't do nearly as well with return rates in our cats as in our dogs. So how many of those cats coming in are euthanized? And again, getting good data is really tough because it really is highly variable. But the estimates are somewhere between 1.5 to 2 million, somewhere between 50, maybe 70% of cats are being euthanized coming into shelters. It also depends on what kind of a cat you are, what your risks are for being euthanized. If you're an old cat, you've got a higher risk than an adult cat who has a higher risk than a kitten, for example, of being euthanized. If you're unsocialized, feral, in many, many shelters, being a feral cat is a death sentence. Certainly if you come in sick, or if you get sick while you're in the shelter, you are more likely to be euthanized. And of course, cats with pre-existing, if the owner is willing to admit that, the cat that's already urinating outside the box is more likely to be euthanized than one that does not have that kind of history. Is euthanasia always bad? We tend to think that we shouldn't be euthanizing, and certainly I agree with that. But it's not that simple, because I think that there are places where euthanasia is very appropriate. And if the cat is severely ill, mortally injured, or in fact would require $5,000 to save the life of that animal, when that $5,000 could be used to save the lives of 100 other animals. Aggressive cats, should we be in shelters adopting out a known aggressive cat that could cause an injury to human beings? Unsocialized, we've already heard about some of the strategies now to try to get these cats unsocialized rather than euthanize them to get them back into their environment. What about diseases that are manageable in homes, but given that somebody's in the shelter only about 8 hours a day and can't administer perhaps the medication this cat requires on the frequency that it would require it, or is going to require a lot of money or is going to sit there in that shelter for 6 months or a year before somebody finally walks in and agrees to take that animal home, are those justifiable reasons for euthanasia? We do have some data. It appears like, and again, these data are a little bit dated now, but in a study that was done in the mid-90s of shelters across the country, 17% of owner-surrendered cats were old, quite ill, or had some kind of a behavioral problem, looking very much like the cat that would be brought to a veterinary office for euthanasia. And the thought being that these cats people may be using the shelter in some instances in place of going to a veterinarian because of the cost, because it may be less costly for them to obtain the euthanasia, and in fact, these cats have lived a good life, and now it is time to euthanize them. We need more recent data, and I think we need to think more about this and understand better what brings a person in to a shelter for euthanasia as opposed to going to a veterinarian. Of course, there are wide variability. You know, it's really, we as human beings want to make things simple. We want to see a number, a summary number. But in fact, in this large country, it is highly variable. Many of our estimates are. So here's these data come from Colorado, where in fact, the shelters there are required to be licensed and required to report data. And based on 108 shelters that had data for a full 8 years, they euthanized in 2007 about 38% of the cats coming in. Interestingly enough, because of much of Colorado is undergoing a very vast increase in human population, they have looked at per thousand, the number of euthanasias of cats per thousand human population, trying to correct for the fact that if you have more people, you have more animals, and therefore you're probably doing more euthanasia just because you have more animals, not necessarily because the rate itself has changed. And they found a 36% increase across from 2000 to 2005 in the per thousand, the euthanasias per human thousand population over that period. It would be interesting to see whether that trend, it's quite disturbing, whether that has actually continued on into 2012. Data from 96 versus, this is just 2 years, 1996 versus 2004, 71% euthanized, cats were euthanized. These are in municipal shelters now, where you would expect to see probably higher euthanasia rates. But it was, again, a 14% increase in the rate of cat euthanasias in these shelters in that time frame. So again, is this happening in other parts of the country? I don't know the answer to that because the data are so sparse. The other thing I want to point out is these actually come from the Jacksonville data in 2006 and 2007. Here's a shelter that their euthanasia rate was 80% plus. And you can see the motivation for trying to find another way, because many of these were stray cats. And they were able, of course, I don't have the more recent data, to really turn this completely around when they bring these animals in. Don't euthanize them, and instead put them back out into their communities. So let's talk a little bit about cats dying in the shelters. Some mortality is inevitable. That you get a certain mortality in kittens, you're going to see some older cats come in that may die. They may not be perceived to be suffering, but they die within the shelter. The worrisome part is that we have a few, and I'm happy to say that it appears to be a small percentage, but we have documented there are a few shelters that bring in cats that are healthy, and usually because of overcrowding, usually because they want to save as many animals as they possibly can, they will start to overcrowd and exceed their capacity to provide good care, including good preventive medicine care. And so what happens is a kitten or a cat comes in healthy, and it may end up dying of respiratory disease, or maybe even worse, get euthanized. So that we in a humane organization are bringing in animals, making them sick by poor management, by not doing well by them in our care, and then calling ourselves humane, and we somehow improve the welfare of those cats. So it's something to think about. I don't want to suggest that is common, but it certainly exists. What about while they're in the shelter? Well, it all depends again. It depends on a lot of things. Shelters vary widely in regards to how they manage their animals. And not all of them are an Erie County SPCA. But so in order to kind of talk about this, I just picked out the 5 freedoms that, of course, were developed for our livestock species, but I think serve as a guideline to kind of look at, well, how well are our cats doing in shelters, and raise some of the issues that might arise in the care of animals with shelters. So freedom from fear and distress. And again, it gets complicated when you start thinking about it. Because what if you just brought one of those cats in who was near death from a hoarding situation? Is that cat, its chances overall for good welfare now have been considerably enhanced. If I'm an unsocialized cat in many shelters coming into the shelter, the overall outcome for me is probably going to be death. And from the cat's point of view, I'm sure the cat would argue that that's perhaps not the best welfare. I will say this, that I think every one of these groups, regardless, is highly stressed at the time that they enter the shelter. And we are looking for strategies to try to minimize that stress as they come from whatever environment they originated in into a facility with all different kinds of smells, barking dogs in many cases, all the human smells and handling. And can you think of a more stressful environment? It's hard to think of one for a cat than a shelter, even in a well-run shelter. And you have to ask, do these animals have freedom from fear and distress? Freedom from hunger and thirst. I think we do a pretty good job with thirst. I like to believe that we at least provide fresh water for our animals. I think that there are some concerns I have in shelters that are not participating in some of the programs that provide. Hills and Purina have programs that provide consistent, good quality food. A lot of shelters still depending on people donating food, so whatever comes through the door. So you may start a cat out on Friskies Moist and then move it to something with Purina and the diarrhea and what have you that we see as a consequence of that, I would like to argue is a threat to at least to their welfare temporarily. I think that we have some data now that's beginning to accumulate that would demonstrate that within those first 2 to 3 weeks in the shelter, a high proportion of our cats are losing weight. That's a physiological stress. And this particular study tied that to what looks like an increased risk of upper respiratory tract infections going along with that weight loss. I also, I mean, this is a funny, I know this is kind of a extreme and funny, I mean, obviously we're not seeing a whole bunch of cats coming in like this, but obesity in our cats is increasing in the shelters as well, not both by coming in, and then I have a number of anecdotal stories where people in the shelter, thinking that they're providing better care for these animals, feed them. And even though they come in, you know, not that big, but come in already obese, they begin to feed them more. And they're often very good beggars. And then what do we do about these guys? How do we provide for care? Because they're harder to adopt. And if we want to get them on a weight-reducing diet, there are worries about hepatic lipidosis, how to manage that in a shelter where you've got all these other animals. There's a trend toward colony housing. How do you, when it's one cat housed with many other cats, how are you going to do that? So I think we can't just worry about the thin cats anymore. I think we really have to think about how we're going to manage our heavy cats. Freedom from discomfort. Many shelters still have small 2x2 cages with stainless steel cages. This is one that has been retrofitted with a portal so that now one cat can occupy both spaces because, I bet I don't have a good picture of it. Well, we can look at this because it's true of many of the stainless steel cages too, where a cat lives in a little tiny space, very often sitting in the litter box because it hasn't much other place to go. Its food is right near the litter box. It has very little space to move. Certainly, I mean, you're not even talking about it being able to express normal behaviors like scratching, stretching, etc. Unfortunately, I mentioned before, we still have shelters who think that the more they bring in, the more they can save. And certainly that's true, but not all at one point, not all at one time. Other environmental factors. Temperature. We've been in shelters where it's comfortable, the thermostat is set at 72 degrees. It's comfortable for human beings, but the temperature in the upper level of cages is 78 degrees. The temperature in the lower level cages is maybe 64 or 5 degrees. Depending on the layout, depending on sunshine coming in, depending on proximity to where the windows are. So thinking that you have even something without paying attention and really consciously looking at what is the environment and the microenvironments that exist in these shelters, you can find real variations within a shelter itself. Of course, barking dogs, no places to escape. We are advocating for hide boxes in our shelters, but many shelters have yet to provide those kinds of things. No mental stimulation. I know there's going to be a talk on enrichment, which I think we really need to attend to in the shelters as well. Freedom from pain, injury, and disease. This is just a graph in a shelter showing these are the actual incidence rates of upper respiratory disease. So the longer you stay in the shelter, the more likely you are to get an upper respiratory tract infection, both as a consequence of exposure to other cats with upper respiratory, but also stress, because cats, one of the big offenders of cat upper respiratory tract disease is a herpes virus. And herpes virus, you stress an animal with herpes virus, you're going to get, in a certain proportion of them, you're going to get recrudescence of that infection. And make no mistake, cats with upper respiratory, even though it's just a cold, suffer. Some more than others, obviously. And then we have these other diseases, these other infectious diseases that we have to try to minimize. Many of them we will never completely remove. These agents are so well evolved to go from host to host. We'll never completely eliminate them, but yes, we can try to minimize and drive them down to their very lowest possible level. What about expressing normal behaviors? Again, so many of these shelters are 2x2, have small 2x2 cages. Can they scratch, climb, exercise, play with other cats? I will say this, shelters have come a very long way. Erie County's being a really good example. For those of you who haven't been there, I would strongly recommend that you go. Barbara and her crew have done a lot to try to attend to all minimizing the threats to welfare in all of these categories. But we have many shelters that have a long ways to go. And I think that we'll close by saying that, thinking about welfare is very complex. And if you think about it, here we are thinking about welfare of another species. That seems to be particularly challenging because we have a tendency to impose upon them our own beliefs and see them through the prism of a human being. And I haven't really talked about it, but a lot of these depend on the degree to which they happen, the length, how long, if a cat is brought in and put into a 2x2 cage, but it's only going to be there 2 days before it's then moved and neutered and then put out onto the adoption floor where it's in fact in a large colony, that may be not bad at all. The thing we have to keep in mind is that animals tend to live in the present. They tend to live right now. And they can't say, well, okay, you've kept me here for 6 months, but my forever home may come in, tomorrow. They're not thinking that way. We may be thinking that way. But they are living in the moment. They only know that which they're experiencing right now. And then, of course, welfare is all compared to what? If I just came out of a hoarding situation, a shelter may look pretty darn good, depending on how bad that situation was. So anyway, I'll close by saying I don't think we can't be complacent. We have made light years in terms of progress towards improving the welfare of our cats in our shelters. But I think we need to keep seeking more and better solutions so that we can not only improve even better, more on the better shelters, but in fact bring to the shelters that don't have the advantage or the luxury of having a director like Barbara Carr trying to improve the welfare of those cats as well. Thank you.